The world of Ferrix was never meant to be a battlefield. A backwater industrial planet located on the fringes of the Aldhani sector, it was a place where generations of workers toiled in the foundries, shaping starship components, engine housings, and metalwork destined for faraway ships they would never see. The people of Ferrix lived simple, hardworking lives. Yet, in the early days of the Galactic Empire, in a time when rebellion was but a whisper, Ferrix would become an unlikely flashpoint, one of the first visible acts of defiance against Imperial rule. This is the story of the Ferrix Rebellion, a moment in history that saw ordinary people rise against the suffocating grip of the Empire. At first, the Empire didn't concern itself with Ferrix. It had no strategic significance, no political weight. The planet's industry served larger Imperial supply chains, but for years, Ferrix remained under the jurisdiction of the Primor Authority, a corporate-backed security force overseeing the Aldhani sector. The Primor Authority, though nominally independent, operated under Imperial oversight, maintaining order in the name of efficiency rather than ideology. That changed in 5 BBY when a single, seemingly minor incident drew the gaze of the Empire. A man named Cassian Andor, a drifter and scrapper known to the locals, killed 2 Primor officials in the city of Ferrix. It wasn't an act of rebellion, but one of survival. Yet, to the ambitious Deputy Inspector Syril Karn, this was a challenge to Primor authority that could not go unanswered. His pursuit of Andor would set into motion a series of events that exposed the frailty of corporate control and invited the Empire to tighten its grip. Karn's heavy-handed tactics backfired spectacularly. His forces, unfamiliar with the stubborn resilience of the Ferrix community, found themselves outmaneuvered and humiliated when attempting to arrest Andor. Their failure embarrassed Primor authority and led to an immediate response from Coruscant. Ferrix would no longer be under the loose governance of corporate security. The Empire was coming. In the months that followed, Ferrix was transformed. The once semi-autonomous world fell under direct Imperial rule, and the transition was anything but smooth. The Imperial Security Bureau established a presence, a garrison of stormtroopers patrolled the streets, and local workers were conscripted into forced labor. Curfews were imposed, movement was restricted, and surveillance tightened. The town bell, once a symbol of daily life, now rang not just to mark the hours, but to signal the ever-present weight of Imperial oppression. The people of Ferrix were no strangers to hardship, but the Empire had underestimated their resolve. The traditions of the Ferrix workers ran deep. Community, mutual aid, and quiet defiance had always been their way. Though they didn't consider themselves revolutionaries, but they resisted in the only ways they knew how. Machinery would break at inconvenient times, tools would go missing, rumors spread in the shadows, and above all, they watched, waiting for a moment to strike back. Among those who refused to submit was an elderly woman named Marva Andor. Once a scavenger, a trader, and a mother to Cassian Andor, Marva had seen the Republic give way to the Empire. She had witnessed the slow erosion of freedoms, and now, as her body weakened, her spirit burned hotter than ever. Marva's speeches and secret gatherings became the heartbeat of the resistance. She urged her fellow Ferrix citizens not to accept the Empire as an immovable force, but as an invader that could be repelled. "We've been sleeping," she told them, "and now we have to wake up." Her words spread, whispered from worker to worker, seeping into the fabric of Ferrix's daily life. When Marva passed, it wasn't just the loss of a beloved elder, it was the final insult the people would endure. Marva's funeral was the moment the Empire made a mistake it couldn't undo. Imperial authorities, recognizing the potential for unrest, sought to limit attendance. They miscalculated. The people of Ferrix came in numbers far beyond expectation, crowding the streets to pay their respects. The Empire's presence was met with cold, simmering defiance. And then, from beyond the grave, Marva spoke. A pre-recorded message, played through the droid B2 EMO, delivered her final words to the people she loved. She told them the truth, that the Empire had taken their freedoms, that they had let themselves be lulled into submission, but that it wasn't too late. "We were sleeping," her voice echoed through the streets. "I've been sleeping, and I've been turning away from the truth I wanted not to face. There is a wound at the center of the galaxy, and it's growing." The people of Ferrix listened, and then, as the ISB watched in alarm, they acted. The funeral erupted into a full-scale riot. The crowd surged forward, hurling debris, fighting stormtroopers with their bare hands, using anything they could find as weapons. The Empire, so used to crushing organized military resistance, was caught off guard by the raw fury of a people who refused to kneel. A bomb, planted by a young rebel, exploded amidst the stormtrooper ranks, sending panic through the Imperial forces. Blaster fire erupted. Ferrix was no longer just a world of workers, it was a battlefield. The rebellion on Ferrix didn't bring the Empire down, of course. It didn't spark a galactic uprising overnight, but it was something just as important. It was proof. Proof that the Empire wasn't invincible. Proof that even an unarmed populace could stand against tyranny. Though many perished in the battle, and though the Empire retaliated with further crackdowns, the Ferrix uprising sent ripples through the nascent rebellion. Word of the defiance spread. Stories reached faraway rebels, stories of ordinary people who fought back with nothing but their courage. Cassian Andor, who had spent his life running from one fight to the next, saw the impact of what his home had done, and in the flames of Ferrix, he found his purpose. In the years following the Republic's fall, the newly formed Galactic Empire sought to do what no government had ever truly achieved: total control. Its massive war machine was already unrivaled, its fleets unmatched, and its armies endless, but Emperor Palpatine knew that brute force alone wasn't enough to maintain dominion over the galaxy. True power wasn't built on conquest, but on fear. On the knowledge that no act of dissent, no whisper of rebellion would go unseen or unpunished. Thus, the Imperial Security Bureau was born. The ISB wasn't simply an intelligence agency, it was the Empire's secret police, a force dedicated not just to hunting enemies of the state, but to ensure that such enemies never arose in the first place. Through surveillance, infiltration, and unrelenting psychological warfare, the ISB turned entire sectors into prisons without walls. Its agents, faceless and ever-present, shaped the fears of the galaxy in ways no warship ever could. In this segment, we're going to explore the rise of the ISB, the minds behind its ruthless efficiency, and how it became one of the Empire's deadliest weapons. The transformation of the Republic into the Empire was swift, but its infrastructure didn't change overnight. The Republic had its own intelligence networks, many of which had been built for counterterrorism during the Clone Wars. The Senate Bureau of Intelligence, the Republic Security Force, and the Judicial Department's Special Operations branches had spent years fighting insurgents, pirates, and separatist holdouts. When Palpatine seized control, these organizations were not dismantled, they were absorbed. One of the key figures in this transformation was Colonel Wolf Yularen, a former Republic admiral who had fought alongside the Jedi in the Clone Wars. A loyal officer and a firm believer in order above all else, Yularen was chosen to help restructure the Republic's intelligence services into something far more effective and far more terrifying. The newly formed Imperial Security Bureau was officially tasked with maintaining state security. Unofficially, it was tasked with something far greater: absolute ideological control. Unlike the Imperial military, which operated under a rigid chain of command, the ISB functioned more like a collection of specialized departments, each focused on a different aspect of control. Some of the most important divisions included the Surveillance and Enforcement Division, which were the eyes and ears of the Empire and tasked with monitoring civilian populations, industries, and even military officers for signs of treason. Every world, every major city, and every communications network fell under their jurisdiction. Another was the Internal Security Division, responsible for investigating Imperial personnel, including Moffs, Admirals, and Stormtrooper legions. It wasn't enough for the Empire to destroy its external enemies, it had to ensure its own forces remained absolutely loyal. The Rebel Suppression Branch originally formed to monitor minor criminal uprisings, but this division became one of the most feared. As whispers of rebellion spread, it was the Rebel Suppression Branch that authorized preemptive strikes against suspected insurgents, often before they had even committed a crime. And lastly, we have the Truth and Propaganda Bureau. While the ISB relied on fear, it also relied on control of information. This branch worked alongside COMPNOR, the Commission for the Preservation of the New Order, to shape public perception of the Empire, spreading misinformation and rewriting history as needed. Each branch had its own agenda, and often, its agents worked against one another in their hunger for favor from Coruscant. This internal competition ensured that only the most ruthless officers rose through the ranks. By 5 BBY, the ISB had expanded beyond anything the Republic had ever envisioned. It no longer merely investigated crimes, it prevented them from ever occurring. The ideal ISB officer was not just a soldier or a spy, but a strategist who could anticipate dissent before it became a threat. Few embodied this philosophy more than Supervisor Dedra Meero. Dedra Meero was not a high-ranking Moff or a feared Inquisitor. She was a mid-level officer within the ISB's hierarchy, one of many supervisors tasked with regional security. But what set her apart was her approach. While her colleagues dismissed reports of scattered thefts, missing shipments, and isolated acts of sabotage, Meero saw a pattern. She understood something the rest of the ISB had not yet grasped, that rebellion was not a series of unconnected incidents, it was a movement in the making. Unlike many of her peers who were content to react to threats, Meero sought to engineer the battlefield before the war began. Her insistence on viewing minor insurgencies as part of a greater whole earned her both admiration and enemies within the Bureau. To her, the key to stopping rebellion was to force it out into the open and then crush it. Her pursuit of Cassian Andor, therefore, an insignificant thief on the surface, wasn't just about him. It was about drawing out Luthen Rael, the unseen architects of resistance. Meero understood that the most dangerous enemies were not the ones who fought battles, but the ones who built networks. Ferrix was never meant to be a battlefield, yet it became one because of the ISB's cold calculations. When Meero identified Andor as a potential link to greater rebel activity, she didn't simply order an arrest, she orchestrated a demonstration of Imperial power. The ISB's presence on Ferrix grew rapidly after the failed Premor intervention. Stormtroopers replaced corporate security, surveillance intensified, locals were interrogated, threatened, and in some cases disappeared. The ISB ultimately wanted more than Andor. They wanted Ferrix itself to serve as an example of what happened to those who defied Imperial order. Yet, despite its meticulous control, the ISB underestimated the people of Ferrix. Their attempts to crush dissent only fueled it, culminating in the full-scale riot that erupted at Marva Andor's funeral. The Ferrix uprising was a warning sign that even the ISB's most calculated oppression couldn't fully suppress the will of the people. Though the ISB failed to contain Ferrix, its doctrine of preemptive suppression would remain one of the Empire's most powerful tools. Over the next few years, as the rebellion grew bolder, the ISB shifted its focus from preventing insurgency to exterminating it. It would go on to oversee mass incarcerations, infiltration of rebel cells, and eventually the development of Project Stardust, the Death Star, the ultimate weapon of deterrence. Yet even with the power to destroy entire worlds, the Empire never stopped relying on the ISB's more subtle weapon, the quiet, constant fear that one's every action, every conversation might be watched. For Palpatine, the goal was never just military victory. It was to build a galaxy where resistance was unthinkable, and for that, the ISB was his perfect instrument. Before the rebellion had a fleet, before it had bases, before it was even called the rebellion, there were only scattered groups of insurgents. angry people striking out in the dark, alone. Some were former Republic loyalists who had watched democracy rot from within. Others were the sons and daughters of conquered worlds, forced to kneel before the Empire's growing shadow. But for all their hatred of Imperial rule, they were unconnected, uncoordinated. Then came a man who saw the truth, that rebellion wasn't about anger or even justice, it was about patience, about sacrifice. It was about building something that could last. His name was Luthen Rael, and he was a ghost. He didn't command armies, he didn't claim credit, he didn't seek power, and yet, in the years before the Galactic Civil War, it was Luthen who laid the foundation for the rebellion that would one day bring an empire to its knees. To this day, the true origins of Luthen Rael remain a mystery. The Empire never had a comprehensive file on him, and even his closest allies knew little of where he had come from. Some believed he was once an intelligence officer for the Republic, disillusioned after watching Palpatine dismantle the Senate. Others whispered that he had been a separatist strategist, surviving the fall of the Confederacy, only to wage war against the new regime in secret. But the truth? To be real, the truth didn't matter. Luthen was whoever he needed to be. To some, he was an antiquities dealer on Coruscant, a charming, eccentric collector catering to senators, nobles, and imperial elites. His gallery was filled with rare artifacts from across the galaxy, from ancient Jedi relics to Mandalorian armor. But beneath the facade, the shop was more than a place of business. It was a front for rebel intelligence operations, a meeting ground where whispers of defiance were exchanged over priceless treasures. To others, he was a shadow, a spy master who moved between sectors like smoke, never staying in one place long enough to be caught. He had no official rank, no uniform, no insignia. He wasn't a leader of the rebellion because the rebellion didn't even exist yet. He was something more dangerous, the architect of its birth. Luthen understood something that many early rebels did not, that fighting the Empire wasn't about winning battles, it was about surviving long enough to wage a war. In the years before Yavin, most acts of defiance against the Empire were local. A group of freedom fighters on one world had no connection to insurgents on another. They had no shared resources, no means of communication. Each was doomed to be crushed in isolation. Luthen set out to change that. Through carefully cultivated contacts, he began identifying resistance groups across the galaxy. He found a militant cell on Onderon, led by a young Saw Gerrera, willing to do whatever it took to strike at the Empire, rogue intelligence officers inside the ISB who despised what the Empire had become, and disgruntled ex-senators, former Republic officers, and ordinary people whose homes had been stripped away by Imperial rule. One by one, he brought them together. Not in person, not yet, that was just too risky. But through middlemen, couriers, and coded transmissions, he began to weave a network of silent defiance. Luthen's philosophy was simple. The time for mass uprisings had not yet come. The rebellion had to be built in the shadows, hidden beneath layers of secrecy. If any single cell was captured, the others had to be insulated. No names, no direct communication, no unnecessary risks. It was this philosophy that brought him to Cassian Andor. Not because Andor was a leader, but because he was exactly the kind of soldier Luthen needed. Andor wasn't idealistic, he wasn't reckless, he was practical, a survivor who understood how to move unseen. A man who could kill if necessary, but who knew when not to. A tool waiting to be sharpened. Luthen's recruitment of Andor wasn't simply about the theft of Imperial payrolls. That was a means to an end. What Luthen was truly doing was forcing Cassian to choose a side. Because in Luthen's world, there were only two options: fight or be crushed beneath the boot of the Empire. But Luthen wasn't a hero in the traditional sense of the word. He didn't deal in absolutes of good and evil. He understood what the war would require, the kind of sacrifices that few could stomach. When Anto Krieger, an ally in the fight against the Empire, became compromised, Luthen made a choice few could have. Rather than warn him, rather than risk exposing his greater network, he let Krieger and his men walk into a slaughter. He knew that rebellion wasn't about victories, it was about controlling the battlefield, and sometimes that meant letting good men die so that others might live to fight another day. When questioned about his choices, when asked about what he had sacrificed, Luthen gave the only answer that mattered. Calm, kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I've made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago from which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. Luthen didn't expect to see the rebellion succeed. He didn't believe he would live to see the Empire fall. His role wasn't to win the war, it was to ensure that it could be fought at all. By the time of the Battle of Yavin, Luthen Rael's name was already fading from history. He'd never sought recognition. He'd left no statues, no monuments, but the network he built, the foundations he laid, were the very thing that made the rebellion possible. He never stood alongside Mon Mothma in the bright light of public defiance, and he never led fleets into battle, but without him, there would have been no fleets to lead, no rebels to fight, and no rebellion to speak of. Somewhere, in the shadows of history, he disappeared. Perhaps he died in the war he helped create. Perhaps he simply vanished, his work complete. But his influence lingered in every act of resistance, every battle waged against the Empire. Because before there was a rebellion, there was a man who taught the galaxy how to rebel. The rebellion was never one movement. It was a fractured mosaic of ideologies, tactics, and clashing personalities, bound only by a single, unshakable truth. The Empire had to fall. Among the earliest and most radical of these insurgents was a man who would be both a hero and a cautionary tale. A warrior who fought the Empire long before the rebellion had a name, and whose methods would leave even his allies questioning his cause. Saw Gerrera was a revolutionary before the galaxy even realized it needed one. He didn't wait for politicians to form councils or for idealists to craft manifestos. He fought, and he fought with the certainty of a man who knew that survival was the only victory that mattered. But as the years went on, as the war grew colder and the lines between necessary sacrifice and blind destruction blurred, Saw Gerrera became something else. Something the Rebel Alliance could no longer control. This is the story of a man who was willing to do anything to defeat the Empire, and in doing so, became the first rebel to be branded a terrorist by his own allies. Long before the Empire, long before Palpatine's rise to power, Saw Gerrera was already waging war. His homeworld, Onderon, had been a battlefield during the Clone Wars, caught between Republic control and the Separatist-backed monarchy. When the Separatists installed the Puppet King, Gerrera refused to submit. Alongside his sister, Steela, he led a local insurgency, striking at battle droids with whatever weapons they could scavenge. At first, they were little more than a nuisance to the Separatists. They fought with outdated blasters, homemade explosives, and sheer desperation. But everything changed when the Jedi arrived. Recognizing the potential of the Onderonian resistance, Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ahsoka Tano, and Captain Rex trained Saw and his fighters in guerrilla tactics. They taught them how to set traps, how to strike and disappear, how to use terrain against a superior enemy. Under Republic guidance, Saw transformed from a desperate fighter into a tactician. But it wasn't tactics that won him the war, it was sacrifice. During the final battle for Onderon's freedom, Saw's sister, Steela, the heart of the resistance, was killed. She had been the leader the people followed, the voice of hope that inspired them. Saw had always been the fighter, but without Steela, he became something more dangerous. A soldier who no longer believed in hope, only in war. When the Clone Wars ended, the Republic fell and the Empire rose in its place. Onderon found itself once again under the boot of a tyrant, but this time there were no Jedi to help. There were no Republic supplies, no official backing. Saw Gerrera was alone. Yet, he did what he had always done. He fought. Without support, without resources, his war against the Empire became even more brutal. The old tactics were no longer enough. It wasn't enough to simply strike military targets. Fear had to be used as a weapon. Imperial supply lines had to be destroyed even if civilians starved as a result. Imperial officers had to be assassinated even if the retaliation fell upon innocent people. To Gerrera, these weren't acts of cruelty, they were acts of survival. But survival, of course, comes at a cost. With every year that passed, Saw Gerrera became more isolated. He no longer trusted his allies, seeing compromise as weakness. The rebellion, when it finally began to take shape, was too cautious in his eyes. Mon Mothma spoke of unity, of carefully selecting targets to win the hearts of the people. Gerrera saw this as naive. The people would not rise up because of carefully planned strikes against military installations. They would rise up when the Empire feared them, when they believed that nowhere was safe. This philosophy would set him on a collision course with the Rebel Alliance he had helped to inspire. As rebel cells began to organize under figures like Mon Mothma and Bail Organa, Saw Gerrera and his followers, now calling themselves the Partisans, moved in a different direction. Unlike the fledgling Rebel Alliance, the Partisans operated in absolute secrecy. They had no political ambitions, no desire to win the hearts and minds of the galaxy. They wanted one thing: to hurt the Empire by any means necessary. On the battlefield, the Partisans were terrifying. They used tactics that many considered beyond the pale: bombings, sabotage, assassinations. They targeted not just stormtroopers, but anyone who aided the Empire. Ultimately, to Saw, there was no such thing as an innocent bystander. You were either against the Empire, or you were part of it. This extremism became a growing problem for the Rebel Alliance. Though they needed fighters like Saw, they feared what he was becoming. He was unpredictable, he refused orders, he struck targets without warning. Worst of all, his tactics often invited brutal Imperial retaliation. Retaliation that fell on the very people the rebellion was trying to protect. Mon Mothma, ever the strategist, knew that if the rebellion was to succeed, it needed unity. The galaxy had to see them as freedom fighters, not terrorists. But Saw Gerrera didn't care how the galaxy saw him. He only cared about victory, and he believed that the rebellion's caution would doom it to failure. In the years leading up to the Battle of Yavin, the split became irreparable. The Rebel Alliance formally cut ties with Saw Gerrera, declaring his methods too extreme. He was now a rogue element, a man fighting his own war with no allegiance but to his cause. By 5 BBY, Saw had become more myth than man. His base of operations was hidden deep within the holy city of Jeddah, a planet rich in kyber crystals, the sacred material once used to power Jedi lightsabers, and now the key ingredient in the Empire's new superweapon, the Death Star. Paranoid, half-broken from years of war, and relying on cybernetic life support due to injuries sustained in countless battles, Saw Gerrera was no longer the man who had fought alongside Anakin Skywalker. He had become something darker. He saw spies everywhere, traitors in every shadow. He no longer fully trusted even those closest to him. When Cassian Andor and Jyn Erso arrived on Jeddah seeking information about the Death Star's construction, they found Saw a shell of his former self. He had spent so many years in the dark that he had forgotten what the light looked like. And yet, even in his madness, his instincts were correct. The Empire was on the verge of something catastrophic. The Death Star was no longer a rumor, it was real, and it was about to unleash destruction unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Saw Gerrera died on Jeddah, refusing to run as the Empire tested its new weapon on the city he had called home. He didn't live to see the rebellion's victory. He didn't live to see the Death Star destroyed, but his war didn't end with him. His legacy, his tactics, his fire would live on in rebel factions across the galaxy. Even when the Rebel Alliance distanced itself from his methods, it could never erase his influence. For better or worse, Saw Gerrera had shown the galaxy that the Empire was not untouchable, that resistance was possible, that war had to be fought in the places no one wanted to fight it. And in the end, long after his name faded into history, the war he helped spark would be the one that ended the Empire for good. The Galactic Empire didn't just rule through fleets and armies. It ruled through fear, through bureaucracy, and through the cold, mechanical efficiency of its prison system. For most of the galaxy, the idea of Imperial justice was simple. Obedience was expected, defiance was punished. But punishment wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about control. And nowhere was that control more absolute than in the labor camps of Narkina 5. On the surface, Narkina 5 was nothing special. One of countless moons scattered across the galaxy, it was unremarkable in every way except for one. It was a factory world, and its factories were filled with prisoners. Men stolen from their homes, snatched off the streets, or sentenced for the smallest infractions were fed into a system that treated them not as criminals, but as fuel for the ever-expanding Imperial war machine. It was here that Cassian Andor, once a free man, found himself stripped of his name, his past, and his future. But he wasn't alone. Across the Empire, thousands suffered the same fate. Their stories were countless, but the system that consumed them was one and the same. This is the story of Imperial incarceration, the true machinery of oppression that kept the galaxy in check. Before the Clone Wars, the Republic's judicial system was a patchwork of planetary laws, local enforcers, and corporate security forces. The Republic had prisons, but they were decentralized, their use dictated by sector governments rather than a singular authority. Crime and punishment varied wildly from one system to another, with some planets favoring rehabilitation, while others imposed brutal sentences. But the Empire had no interest in nuance. Palpatine's new order demanded uniformity, and with it came a simple doctrine. Punishment should serve the state. No longer were prisons a place to hold criminals until their sentences were complete. Instead, they became tools of exploitation. From the moment the Empire solidified control, the incarceration rates skyrocketed. Small offenses that once warranted fines or probation now resulted in indefinite detention. Speaking against the Empire in public, failing to meet production quotas, or even simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could lead to a sentence with no trial, no appeal, and no release date. Entire prison colonies were established across the Outer Rim, each designed for maximum efficiency. Some were sprawling, fortress-like structures such as Wabani, where prisoners were left to rot in squalor. Others, like the infamous spice mines of Kessel, were pits of unending labor. But among them, one stood out as especially insidious: Narkina 5, the prison that convinced its inmates to imprison themselves. Located in an isolated region of space, Narkina 5 was a high-security, sterile Imperial forced labor facility, unlike the crude mines of Kessel or the disease-ridden barracks of Wabani. It was clean, it was orderly, and it was designed for absolute control. From the moment new prisoners arrived, they were stripped of all identity. Their names were replaced with numbers, their pasts no longer mattered. All that mattered was the work. The massive factory complex was divided into multiple levels, each housing prisoners who were forced to manufacture components for the Imperial military. The inmates never knew what they were building. They never saw where their work was sent. They were simply told to work faster, to be more efficient, to compete against their fellow prisoners for the privilege of survival. And the most sinister part? They weren't guarded with blasters, but with the very floors they walked on. Narkina 5 was designed with a cruel ingenuity. The entire prison functioned as a giant electric grid. The floors were charged with a lethal current capable of delivering instant, agonizing death at the push of a button. No bars were needed, no chains, no physical guards patrolling the halls. The prisoners were barefoot at all times, knowing that a single step out of line could end their lives in an instant. The system eliminated the need for traditional security. No one ran, no one resisted. There were no riots, no uprisings, only compliance. The prisoners were broken down into competing teams, each working at assembly tables, each desperate to outperform the others. not for freedom, but for survival. Those who performed well were rewarded with food. Those who failed were given nothing. Those who rebelled simply vanished. The daily cycle of Narkina 5 was one of precision and brutality. The wake-up alarm wasn't a siren nor a barked order from a guard, it was the cold, sterile glow of overhead lights. Prisoners were moved in perfect coordination, marching from their cells to the factory floor in total silence. There were no wasted steps, no wasted words. Even speaking at the wrong time could bring punishment. Work was everything. The assembly lines never stopped, and every prisoner knew that efficiency was the difference between life and death. The ranking system, which displayed the performance of each table, was designed to pit prisoners against one another. If a table fell behind, their entire team was punished. If they excelled, they were given the barest of luxuries, a taste of real food, a few moments of reprieve. The guards never interacted directly with the prisoners. They didn't need to. They watched from behind reinforced windows, their hands hovering over control panels. Their power was absolute. The most horrifying part, though, was that the prisoners believed they would be released. Imperial efficiency dictated that inmates be given sentences and each prisoner could see the countdown to their supposed freedom. It was a simple psychological trick. The illusion of hope was the most effective form of control. But hope in Narkina 5 was a lie. The truth was revealed in whispers, passed between prisoners when the guards weren't listening. No one ever left. It wasn't Cassian Andor who discovered the truth. It was Kino Loy, a floor manager who had spent years convincing himself that obedience was the only way to survive. But when he learned that prisoners who had completed their sentences were simply recycled into the system, he understood what the Empire truly was. There was no mercy, no release. The only way out of Narkina 5 was death. And so, the uprising began. It wasn't a coordinated military strike. There weren't any weapons and there were no careful strategies. There was only desperation, only men who had been worked to the brink of exhaustion suddenly realizing they had nothing left to lose. The chaos spread like wildfire. Factory floors became battlefields. Men who spent months in silence screamed as they charged their captors. For all of the Empire's control, for all its calculated cruelty, it had made one fatal mistake. It had assumed its prisoners would never resist. The escape was bloody. Many didn't survive, but some, Cassian Andor among them, made it out, swimming into the freezing waters below, leaving behind a facility in flames. The breakout of Narkina 5 was more than just an escape. It was a revelation. The prisoners who survived carried a message, whispered from world to world. The Empire does not imprison its enemies. It enslaves its own people. From the outer rim to the core, this truth spread. The rebellion didn't begin with starships and armies. It began with knowledge like this. And for many, the knowledge of what had happened on Narkina 5 was the moment they stopped seeing the Empire as a government and started seeing it as something that had to be destroyed. Before there were X-Wings streaking across the battlefields, before rebel leaders gathered in secret war rooms to plan the destruction of the Death Star, before the galaxy even had a rebellion to believe in, there was a single voice speaking against the Empire. It didn't belong to a warrior or a spy, nor to a rogue agent striking from the shadows. It belonged to Mon Mothma, a senator who saw tyranny rise from within and dared to call it by its name. While others fought with blasters, she fought with words. While others built armies, she built alliances. And for years, she stood alone, a quiet force in the heart of an Imperial Senate that no longer served the people. This is the story of Mon Mothma, the woman who risked everything to give the rebellion a chance to exist. Mon Mothma was born into power. Hailing from the wealthy and influential world of Chandrila, she was raised in a culture of diplomacy where rhetoric and negotiation were as natural as breathing. Politics wasn't just a duty, it was a family tradition. By the age of 16, she was already being groomed for leadership, and by 32, she had secured a seat in the Galactic Senate, serving as one of the youngest representatives in the Republic. During the final years of the Republic, Mothma was a rising star. Though idealistic, she wasn't naive. She understood the complexities of government and the necessity of compromise. But even as she worked within the system, she saw the slow decay eating away at it, the rise of emergency powers, the growing militarization of the Senate, and the increasing influence of a single man, Chancellor Palpatine. When war broke out between the Republic and the Separatists, Mothma supported the cause of the Jedi, believing that the Republic had the right to defend itself. But she also saw what others ignored, that war was a tool, a means for Palpatine to consolidate control. And as the years passed, her faith in the system began to fracture. Then, of course, the Republic fell, and Mon Mothma, a senator who had spent her life believing in democracy, awoke to find herself serving an empire. Many senators accepted the Empire's rule, some out of fear, others out of ambition, but Mon Mothma wasn't one of them. Alongside Bail Organa and a handful of other loyalists, she became part of a quiet resistance within the Imperial Senate. It wasn't yet a rebellion. They had no fleet, no armies, but they had influence, and they used it to stall Imperial legislation, to protect dissidents where they could, and to ensure that the last remnants of democracy did not die without a fight. Publicly, Mon Mothma still played the part of the loyal senator. She spoke carefully and avoided outright defiance. She pushed for measured reforms for accountability in the Imperial bureaucracy. But behind closed doors, she funded rebel cells, funneled resources to underground resistance groups, and established the first secret communication networks between Imperial dissidents. It was dangerous work. Every year, the Empire tightened its grip. Every year, another senator vanished. But Mothma understood what many did not. The time for open rebellion had not yet come. The rebellion had to be built in silence, in shadows, because if they moved too soon, if they exposed themselves before they were ready, the Empire would crush them before they had the chance to fight back. By 5 BBY, Mon Mothma's position had never been more precarious. She remained a respected senator in public, but her life had become a delicate balancing act. Every conversation, every vote, every interaction had to be measured. A single wrong step could end her, not just politically, but physically. She lived under constant Imperial surveillance. Every credit she moved, every meeting she arranged was watched. Her home on Coruscant, a grand estate that should have been a place of comfort, had become a prison. And in the midst of it all, she wasn't alone. Her husband, Perrin Further, was a relic of the old Republic aristocracy, privileged, indifferent, and utterly blind to the danger around them. To him, politics was just a game of prestige, not a fight for survival. While Mothma carefully maneuvered to keep her revolutionary activities hidden, Perrin threw lavish parties, mingled with Imperial elites, and dismissed her concerns as paranoia. Even worse, their daughter, Lyda, had grown distant, drawn toward Chandrilan traditions that Mothma herself had abandoned long ago. The more Mothma fought for the future of the galaxy, the more she felt her own family slipping away. But there wasn't room for sentiment, not anymore. To finance the rebellion, she turned to Davos Skulden, a figure from the underworld with deep financial connections. The arrangement was simple. Skulden would help discreetly move her credits, but in exchange, he wanted something unthinkable. A marriage arrangement between his son and Mon Mothma's daughter. It was a test of how much she was willing to sacrifice, and in the end, Mothma made her choice. For the rebellion to survive, her own family had to become collateral damage. For years, Mon Mothma walked a tightrope, carefully maintaining the illusion of loyalty while secretly fueling the fires of rebellion. But illusions couldn't last forever. In 2 BBY, she made her final move. Standing before the entire Senate, she publicly denounced the Emperor. She didn't mince her words. She called the Empire what it was, a dictatorship built on fear and oppression. It was a speech that ensured her death sentence. That very night, she fled Coruscant, abandoning the life she had spent decades building. The Empire declared her a traitor. The ISB hunted her. But it was too late. The moment her words were broadcast across the galaxy, the illusion was shattered. The rebellion was no longer just whispers in the dark, it was real. Unlike Saw Gerrera, who waged war with bombs and assassinations, Mon Mothma understood that rebellion wasn't just about fighting, it was about inspiring. People had to believe in something greater than themselves. They had to believe that the Empire could be defeated. From the shadows, she began organizing the disparate rebel cells into a single unified force. What had once been individual skirmishes became a coordinated military effort. Rebel leaders who had once fought alone now answered to a single authority. She forged an alliance between smugglers, mercenaries, and idealists. She orchestrated the theft of Imperial resources, the formation of hidden bases, the recruitment of soldiers who would one day fight on Hoth, Endor, and beyond. And when the time finally came, when the Death Star was revealed and the war erupted into full scale, it was Mon Mothma who stood before the rebellion and uttered the words that would define the fight to come. We have chosen to fight. Mon Mothma was never the one to fly an X-Wing into battle. She never held a blaster on the front lines, but without her, the rebellion would have never existed. She built it, not with weapons, but with conviction, not with armies, but with alliances. And though she spent years in the shadows, sacrificing everything to keep the dream alive, her name would one day be spoken alongside those of warriors and generals. Because in the end, she was the rebellion's first leader, its conscience, and its future. From the glittering towers of the Imperial Palace to the cold steel of the Senate chambers, Coruscant was the shining heart of the Empire, a world of control, order, and precision. The Empire's propaganda machine painted it as an unassailable symbol of Imperial strength, a city planet where law and order reigned supreme. But beneath its surface, in the tangled depths of its undercity, a different Coruscant existed. One ruled not by Moffs or Grand Admirals, but by crime lords, information brokers, and black market dealers. This was the Underworld, a vast and lawless empire that thrived in the shadows of the Imperial capital. Here, the real business of the galaxy took place. Here, the power was bought and sold in dark alleys, and survival belonged not to the strong, but to the clever. And for those who sought to resist the Empire, spies, smugglers, and insurgents, it was the only place they could hide. To understand Coruscant's underworld, one must first understand its sheer scale. The city stretched from the upper spires, where the wealthiest Imperial elite lived in unimaginable luxury, down to the lowest levels, where the sunlight never reached. Officially, Coruscant was divided into 5,127 levels, each one stacked upon the ruins of civilizations long forgotten. The wealthiest lived on the upper levels, where speeders hummed through the skylanes and the Imperial Security Bureau watched over the populace. But as one descended, the order of the Empire began to unravel. By the time you reached level 1313, the infamous criminal district, the rule of law no longer applied. The Empire's reach did not extend this far, not because it couldn't, but because it had no reason to. Crime wasn't an enemy to be destroyed, crime was a business to be managed. The Empire did not eliminate corruption. It institutionalized it. Unlike the Republic, which had at least maintained the illusion of justice, the Empire had no interest in shutting down criminal enterprises. Instead, it co-opted them, using the underworld as an unofficial extension of its own power. The ISB and Imperial intelligence frequently used crime syndicates as disposable assets. If a rival politician needed to be eliminated, it was often a criminal, not a stormtrooper, who pulled the trigger. If an Imperial officer required off-the-books funding, it was the black market trade in weapons, spice, or even slaves that filled the coffers. Even the Imperial Navy had its hand in the underworld. Smugglers who knew the right people were granted passage through Imperial blockades in exchange for a share of their profits. Pirates were given letters of marque, allowing them to operate freely as long as they only targeted the Empire's enemies. In the end, the Empire didn't just allow crime, it depended on it. While the Emperor and his war machine ruled the upper levels, the lower depths of Coruscant belonged to the syndicates. These weren't petty street gangs. They were empires within the Empire, powerful enough to operate beyond the reach of Imperial law. The Pike Syndicate, infamous spice dealers, used Coruscant as a hub for smuggling routes that stretched from Kessel to the core worlds. Their influence reached into the highest levels of the Empire's aristocracy, many of whom were more than willing to indulge in their illicit trade. The Black Sun, an organization older than the Republic itself, specialized in assassination, extortion, and influence peddling. Its agents did not wear uniforms or carry blasters openly. They walked among senators, admirals, and ISB officers, shaping Imperial policy from the shadows. The Haxian Brood and other mercenary groups operated within the underground fighting pits where fortunes were won and lost in bloodsport. These arenas were frequented not just by criminals, but by Imperial officers, bored aristocrats, and even members of the Emperor's court. But of all the criminal empires that thrived on Coruscant, none were more deeply entangled with the rebellion than the Chandrilan banking clans and the financial crime syndicates. War requires credits. Starfighters have to be bought, weapons need to be smuggled, spies need to be paid, and defectors need to be bribed. The Rebel Alliance, in its earliest days, had no official treasury, no planetary government to fund its operations. Instead, it relied on a network of shadow financiers, wealthy individuals who despised the Empire but could not openly oppose it. Mon Mothma, who still operated in the Senate under the guise of loyalty, funneled millions of credits through these black market channels, using crime syndicates as intermediaries. It was a dangerous game. One mistake, one misplaced credit transfer, and her entire operation would be exposed. To cover her tracks, she turned to men like Davos Skulden, a financier who thrived in Coruscant's underworld. To be clear, Skulden was not a rebel. He didn't care about the cause, but he understood the value of power, and he understood that in a galaxy ruled by the Empire, playing both sides was the surest way to survive. Through figures like Skulden, rebel credits moved through dummy corporations, fake charities, and laundering operations designed as legitimate businesses. Every starfighter that would one day fight above Yavin, every bolt of blast fire exchanged on the battlefield, owed its existence to the underworld economy. Credits weren't the only thing traded in Coruscant's depths. Information was the true currency of power. The rebellion, operating in the shadows, relied on stolen intelligence to stay ahead of the Empire, and for the right price, there were always those willing to sell it. The Slicer Guilds, a loose network of hackers and data thieves, were among the most valuable assets to rebel operatives. These slicers could break through Imperial security systems, steal ship schematics, falsify travel records, and erase identities, a vital tool for a movement that lived in the dark. But the most dangerous information broker of all was Luthen Rail. Unlike the criminals who sold secrets for profit, Luthen collected information to shape the future. He didn't just acquire intelligence, he controlled it. He knew what the ISB was planning before the ISB did. He could predict when a crackdown was coming, who would be arrested, and which rebel cells would be exposed. To the Empire, he didn't exist. To the rebellion, he was the unseen hand that kept them alive. For all its power, for all its legions of stormtroopers and fleets of star destroyers, the Empire never truly controlled Coruscant's underworld. It thought of itself as invincible, as an unshakable force, but beneath its polished exterior, the cracks were already forming. And in those cracks, the rebellion found its foothold. Because in the end, one of the greatest enemies of the Empire wasn't an army, wasn't a fleet, but it was the rot beneath its own foundation. The Empire didn't rule the galaxy through war alone. Armies could crush insurgencies, fleets could blockade worlds, the Imperial Security Bureau could silence whispers of dissent before they grew into shouts of defiance. But all of these things were merely responses, tools for maintaining order after the fact. True control, the kind that lasted, the kind that ensured obedience before resistance could even take shape, came from something far more insidious. It came from the mind. To keep a galaxy in line and to convince billions that submission wasn't just necessary but inevitable, the Empire didn't simply enforce its rule. It wrote the very narrative of reality itself and dictated what was true and what was not, shaping the thoughts and beliefs of its citizens before they even had a chance to question them. The Death Star may have been the most visible symbol of the Empire's power, but its greatest weapon was something far more invisible: propaganda. The Republic had been a government of compromise, of debate, of endless bureaucracy that left truth open to interpretation. It had a free press, a public discourse shaped by countless planetary news networks, each with its own perspective. There was corruption, there was bias, and there was manipulation, but there also was a choice. As the Republic slowly transitioned into the Empire and eventually fell, that choice, of course, ended. The moment Palpatine declared himself Emperor, the very idea of objective truth was erased. News agencies were nationalized under the Imperial Bureau of Communications, an arm of Compnor, the Commission for the Preservation of the New Order. From Coruscant to the Outer Rim, a single narrative took hold. One reality, one voice. The Empire wasn't just a government, it was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. History itself was rewritten. The Clone Wars was reframed as a struggle between order and treachery, with the Jedi painted as conspirators who had tried to overthrow the rightful ruler of the galaxy. The destruction of the Separatists was presented not as the end of a war, but as the final cleansing of corruption. Even the concept of rebellion was molded into something grotesque. The Empire didn't acknowledge insurgents as political dissidents, freedom fighters, or displaced citizens resisting oppression. They were terrorists, criminals, anarchists seeking only to destroy. And in a galaxy conditioned to fear instability, that label was enough. The average citizen didn't see the Empire as an oppressor. They saw it as a protector, a force that maintained stability in a galaxy that had once teetered on the edge of collapse. And that perception didn't happen by accident. It was the result of a carefully orchestrated system of information control that ensured the Empire's version of reality was the only one that existed. Imperial news networks broadcast only sanctioned reports, filtering out any story that didn't serve the regime. Tragedies caused by the Empire were repackaged as accidents or else blamed on insurgent activity. Star systems ravaged by Imperial strip mining were described as economically flourishing under Imperial guidance. The disappearance of dissidents, the arrests, the sudden absence of voices that had once spoken too freely, none of these were acknowledged. Silence was its own form of control. The Imperial education system molded young minds from childhood. History classes were indoctrination, teaching that the galaxy had been saved, not conquered. Schools on core worlds, where Imperial influence was strongest, taught students to identify and report signs of dissent, conditioning them from a young age to see rebellion as something unnatural, something dangerous. Even Imperial architecture reinforced the message. Cities were reshaped to reflect power, symmetry, and control. The cold and towering structures of Imperial design weren't just buildings. They were statements, reminders that the Empire was vast, unshakable, and eternal. For the vast majority of the core in particular, there was never a reason to question the narrative. They lived safe, orderly lives for the most part. They saw order where there had once been war. They saw strength where the Republic had shown weakness, and in their minds, the idea of rebellion wasn't just futile, it was unthinkable. But even the strongest illusion had its cracks, and in Andor, nowhere was that more apparent than on Ferrix. The people of Ferrix were not dissidents by nature. They were workers, tradesmen, a community built on labor and tradition. For years, they lived under corporate rule, under the pre-war authority, which operated with Imperial oversight but without direct Imperial presence. And for a time, that was enough. Then came Cassian Andor's escape, and with it, the first open defiance Ferrix had seen. To the people, it was a moment of rebellion, a small one, a single man slipping through the Empire's fingers. But to the Empire, it was something far more dangerous. It was a narrative problem. The crackdown, therefore, was immediate. The ISB stepped in and replaced corporate control with direct Imperial control. Stormtroopers marched through the streets. Surveillance was tightened, and the once independent community became an occupied city overnight. But the true show of force wasn't the troops or the arrests or the increased restrictions. It was the message that came afterwards. Imperial broadcasts framed the crackdown not as retaliation, but as necessary order. They painted Cassian not as a rogue citizen, but as a dangerous fugitive, a threat to public safety. Ferrix wasn't a victim of oppression, but a world in need of Imperial protection. And for those who saw through the lie, for those who remembered what Ferrix had been before the Empire tightened its grip, the punishment was swift and absolute. For all its power, for all its careful manipulation of truth, the Empire made a crucial mistake. It believed its own propaganda. It believed that fear was enough, that it could rewrite history without consequence, that it could reshape reality so thoroughly that no one would ever question it. But no amount of propaganda could erase the memory of freedom. No amount of news reports could convince a mother whose son had disappeared that the Empire had made her life better. No amount of Imperial education could stop whispers of a rebellion from spreading through back alleys and shadowed corridors. No amounts of military parades could make the workers of Ferrix forget the sound of boots on their streets, the feeling of their neighbors being dragged away in the night. And in the end, that was the Empire's greatest weakness, because all it took was one moment and one speech. On Ferrix, that moment came when Marva Andor's final words shattered the illusion. Her message was raw, unfiltered truth, a truth that no amount of Imperial control could silence. And as her words echoed through the streets, as the people of Ferrix rose up, as stones and fists and flames flew at the Imperial occupiers, the reality of the Empire was laid bare. It wasn't invincible. It wasn't eternal. And for the first time in a long time, the people saw through the lie. For many though, the Empire wasn't an oppressor, but an opportunity. In the vast, rigid hierarchy of Imperial rule, there were those who truly believed in it. Not out of fear, not out of necessity, but out of genuine conviction. They saw order where others saw tyranny, saw discipline where others saw control, and for men like Syril Karn, the Empire wasn't just a government, it was purpose. Syril Karn didn't dream of rebellion. He didn't long for freedom. He longed for structure, for recognition, and for a world where everything was in its proper place. But Andor doesn't present Karn as a villain in the traditional sense of the word. He's not a warlord or a ruthless enforcer of Imperial doctrine. Instead, he's something far more unsettling, a man so desperate for control that he loses himself to it. Syril Karn wasn't born into power. He didn't come from a noble family or a legacy of military service. He was a mid-level corporate functionary, an officer in the Pre-War Authority, the corporate security force responsible for maintaining order in sectors under Imperial oversight. To most, this was a job, a means of maintaining status, drawing a paycheck, and avoiding scrutiny. But to Karn, it was more than that. Karn saw imperfection everywhere. He saw weakness in those around him. Officers who cut corners, men who let corruption slip through the cracks because it was easier than enforcing the law. He didn't believe in the chaos of self-governance or the compromise of diplomacy. He believed in absolute order and in the purity of discipline. He believed in the cold, mechanical efficiency of the system. And when 2 Pre-War officers were killed on Ferrix, Karn saw his moment. It didn't matter that the men had provoked their own deaths, that they'd overstepped their authority. To Karn, their deaths were a challenge to order itself. He didn't see Cassian Andor as a man fleeing a mistake. He saw a stain on the system that had to be cleansed. But Karn, of course, wasn't a warrior nor a strategist. He was a bureaucrat who believed that protocol and procedure would always prevail. And so, when he led his doomed assault on Ferrix, when he stood in the middle of the street in his pristine uniform expecting compliance, he was met instead with something he couldn't comprehend: resistance. Karn's failure was total. The people of Ferrix didn't cower, but rather they fought back, not with weapons or organized rebellion, but with defiance, with the quiet, unspoken solidarity of those who refused to be broken. Karn's forces were humiliated and their authority shattered. His mission, the one that was supposed to prove his worth, ended in disaster. He returned not as a hero, not as the man who restored order, but as a failure, a disgrace in the eyes of both his superiors and himself. And in the Empire, failure was not forgiven. His uniform, his rank, his authority was all stripped. He was left with pretty much nothing, and not even the Primor authority could protect him now, because it had ceased to exist, swallowed by the whole Empire itself. A clear message that the age of corporate governance was over, that the system he had devoted his life to had discarded him without hesitation. Karn eventually returned to his home on Coruscant, but not as an Imperial officer, as a son returning to a mother's suffocating grasp. He viewed his home not as a sanctuary, but as a prison, an extension of the rigid, suffocating expectations that shaped him. His mother, Edie Karn, wasn't an Imperial officer, but she might as well have been. She didn't offer comfort, she didn't offer any love. She measured his worth in obedience, in discipline, and in his ability to rise in the ranks of a system that had already discarded him. She fed and clothed him, but every meal was served with a reminder of his failure. Every conversation was a demand for more, for better, for the success that had always eluded him. Karn didn't resist or rebel. He internalized everything. He buried himself in reports and surveillance records, in the one thing that still gave him purpose: Cassian Andor. It was obsession disguised as duty, and it would become the only thing keeping him alive. Karn's exile was supposed to be permanent. He was supposed to fade into mediocrity, a cog that had failed to fit into the machine. But then he saw her, Dedra Meero, an officer of the Imperial Security Bureau. Dedra was everything Karn had imagined the Empire to be: cold, efficient, uncompromising. She was what he had always wanted to be. Where others saw the ISB as a force of repression, Karn saw perfection, a place where weakness was eliminated, where chaos wasn't tolerated, where order was absolute. But Dedra didn't see Karn as an asset. She saw him for what he was, a desperate man grasping for a purpose that had long since slipped through his fingers. When he came to her, pleading for another chance, she didn't reward him, she simply dismissed him. Yet this rejection only deepened his resolve, because although he didn't have power or authority, he still had faith. He had faith that the Empire would recognize him, faith that if he simply worked harder, if he proved himself, the system would correct itself. And when he saw Dedra in danger, when he watched her nearly torn apart by the people of Ferrix, he acted without hesitation. He believed in that moment he was fulfilling his purpose. He saved her, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he'd found his place again. Karn's story isn't one of redemption nor triumph. It's a cautionary tale, a story of a man who placed his faith in an unforgiving system and who believed that if he just followed enough rules, if he just wanted it badly enough, he would matter. But the Empire doesn't reward loyalty, it exploits it. Karn wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. He didn't seek to crush the rebellion out of malice or thirst for power or conquest. He simply wanted order. And that is precisely what makes his story so terrifying. Because the galaxy is full of men like Syril Karn. Men who don't question, men who don't resist, men who believe so completely in the system that even when it abandons them, they can't let go. And in the end, that devotion isn't rewarded with glory but with irrelevance. For all his ambition, for all his belief, Syril Karn will never be a Grand Moff, he'll never be a war hero, he'll never rise through the ranks of the ISB. He'll always be what he has always been. A man waiting for a system that doesn't care about him to finally notice him. Cassian Andor didn't choose to be a rebel. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to take a stand, and he didn't believe in causes and noble sacrifices and in the kind of grand ideals that others fought and died for. He was simply a survivor, a man who had spent his life moving from one fight to the next, slipping through the cracks of a galaxy that never seemed to offer him a place. But the truth was that Cassian had been at war for as long as he could remember. Even before he had a name, before he understood what the Empire truly was, war had already stolen from him. His childhood was robbed of its innocence. His homeworld Kenari was stripped bare before he even had a chance to know it. His people, his family, his entire way of life was erased, reduced to nothing more than a footnote in an Imperial report. War took everything from Andor, and in its place, it left a boy who would learn again and again that survival meant running, hiding, and adapting. To stay alive meant he had to become someone else, over and over again, until there was nothing left of the child who had once stood in the jungles of Kenari, looking up at the sky in wonder. Cassian Andor didn't choose rebellion, but rebellion, in the end, would choose him. Cassian's earliest years were spent in exile, taken from Kenari by Marva Andor and raised on Ferrix under a name that wasn't his own. He learned that survival was about being unseen. The galaxy was vast, but it seemed to have no place for people like him. Orphans from forgotten worlds, remnants of the destruction the Empire left in its wake. If he was to live, he had to disappear into the margins. Ferrix became a kind of home, but home was always temporary. The streets, the scrapyards, the sound of the bell that marked the passing of time, these things gave structure to his days, but they didn't give him purpose. Work came and went, jobs were taken and then abandoned. Each one was a step towards something. Credits, escape, another life. But no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, the Empire was always there. It didn't matter that he wasn't a soldier, that he had no cause. The Empire didn't care. Its reach was infinite, its grip unyielding. He could keep his head down, live in the shadows and pretend he was nothing, but eventually it would find him. And when it did, he would have to make a choice. For years, Cassian fought against the very idea of choosing a side. It's clear in the early episodes that he wasn't a fighter and he wasn't a leader. He had no interest in heroism and no illusions about war. Those who believed in causes died for them, and Cassian had spent too many years staying alive to throw it all away for something as fragile as hope. But hope, as much as he wanted to deny it, had a way of finding him. Luthen Rael saw it even when Cassian couldn't. He saw the way Cassian moved, the way he adapted, the way he understood the Empire's weaknesses in ways no soldier ever could. Cassian was far from being a war hero on the battlefields, but he did fight in the quiet places, in the back alleys and corridors where war wasn't loud, but silent and deadly. He had no allegiances, no loyalties, and no higher purpose, and that made him a very dangerous man. It was never about turning him into a hero. Luthen didn't need heroes, he needed weapons. He needed men who could do what was necessary, men who could kill without hesitation, and men who could operate in the spaces between morality and necessity. Although Cassian didn't believe in the rebellion at first, the war was already waiting for him. The moment Cassian Andor truly chose a side was a decision made in the aftermath of loss. On Aldhani, he had fought for money and not for the cause. He pulled off one of the boldest heists in the early days of the rebellion and helped deal a crippling blow to the Empire's war machine, but even then, he hadn't believed. He hadn't seen himself as one of them, and so he ran. But there was nowhere to run. The Empire continued to tighten its grip. In response to Aldhani, it doubled its efforts to crush resistance. Mass arrests and martial law were implemented and meant to ensure that no one ever dared to challenge its rule again. And Cassian, who had tried to escape it all, who had thought he could simply take his credits and disappear, became one of the millions swallowed by the Empire's machine. Narkina 5 was the moment Cassian understood what the Empire truly was. It wasn't just oppression, it was control at its most absolute. A prison built on silence, on obedience, on the lie that those inside had ever been meant to leave. He had spent his life running, fighting only when he had to, believing that the war was something that could be avoided. but Narkina 5 showed him the truth. There was no escaping. No amount of running or hiding would ever be enough. The Empire would always come for people like him. The only way to survive was to fight back. And so, when the prisoners rose, when the alarms blared and the floors went cold and the walls of the prison fell away to reveal the open water beyond, Cassian didn't hesitate. He ran, he fought, and ultimately, he chose. Cassian's hero arc didn't happen overnight. The seed had been planted and the conviction was growing in his heart, but ultimately he was still the same man, still a survivor, still someone who had spent too many years keeping his head down, knowing that hope was dangerous, knowing that believing in something only ever got you killed. But the difference was this: for the first time in his life, he knew what he was fighting against, and in time, he would come to understand what he was fighting for. He would stand in the streets of Ferrix, watching Martha's last message burn through the silence, hearing her tell the people what he had spent his whole life running from. That the Empire wasn't just an enemy, it was a sickness, and the only cure was to stand, to fight, and to rebel. He would stand in the war rooms of Yavin 4, taking orders from men and women who now called him a leader, knowing that every mission he undertook was a step closer to something bigger than himself. And one day, eventually, he would stand on a beach in Scarif, looking up at the sky, watching as the weapon he had helped expose wiped away everything in its path, knowing that he would not live to see the galaxy he had helped save. In the end, Cassian Andor didn't choose the rebellion chose him. Revolutions are built on sacrifice. They're forged in blood and in loss and in the quiet moments where men and women choose to risk everything for a cause they'll never live to succeed. But revolutions are also built on ideas. Armies may win wars, but it's ideology that sustains them and that turns resistance into something larger than battlefields and tactics. And for Karis Nemik, the rebellion wasn't just about fighting, it was about understanding why the fight was necessary. To Nemik, the rebellion wasn't a matter of survival, but of inevitability. Unlike a lot of other people, he didn't believe the Empire was invincible. He believed that its fall was a certainty, and it was written into the very fabric of its existence. He was determined to leave behind the words that would help others see this truth. His death would be sudden, brutal, and meaningless in the immediate moment. Crushed under the weight of stolen Imperial credits, his final breaths taken in the chaos of escape, and his body another casualty in a war that had just barely begun. But Nemik understood something that the Empire never could. Martyrs aren't just men who die for a cause, they're men whose words refuse to die with them. Long before he'd ever picked up a weapon, Nemik was already fighting. He fought with words, with ideas, and with the kind of relentless conviction that made others uncomfortable because it forced them to question what they had allowed themselves to accept. The Empire didn't simply rule through military strength, it ruled through habit, through apathy, and through the slow and systematic erosion of freedom so gradual that most people never noticed it happening. The real weapon of tyranny isn't oppression but normalization. People didn't wake up one day and find themselves in chains, they adjusted, piece by piece, to smaller restrictions, to the quiet silencing of dissent, and to the reshaping of history until the world they lived in was unrecognizable from the one that had existed before. Nemik understood this better than most. He saw the danger not just in the Empire's actions, but in the silence of those who had learned to live under it. And he refused to be silent. His manifesto was an autopsy of the Empire's methods, a precise dissection of how totalitarianism functioned, how it spread like a sickness, and how it convinced people to submit without ever realizing they had given up their own agency. He didn't simply argue that the rebellion was necessary, he argued that it was unavoidable. Oppression, he believed, was self-defeating. The Empire's greatest flaw was its own arrogance. It didn't just demand obedience, it demanded complacency, and that was a demand it could never fully enforce. Somewhere, always, there would be people who resisted, not because they chose to, but because it was the natural response to tyranny. His words weren't theories, they were warnings. For all his convictions and for all his understanding of the Empire's flaws, Nemik wasn't prepared for what rebellion truly cost. He wasn't a warrior, He was a thinker and a strategist, someone who believed in the cause with his mind before he ever had to believe in it with his hands. Aldhani changed that. The heist was never about stealing money. It was a strike against Imperial complacency and a reminder that the rebellion was already growing in the places the Empire had forgotten to watch. It was a test not just for the crew but for Nemik himself, and he was afraid. He had spent so long believing in the certainty of revolution and in the inevitability of resistance, but theory didn't prepare him for the weight of a blaster in his hands. Nor did it prepare him for the moment when the first shots were fired, when the plan went from strategy to survival. It didn't prepare him for the sudden and brutal chaos of real war. Yet even in fear, he didn't falter. Even as adrenaline and panic surged through him, even as blaster fire ripped through the garrison, he didn't hesitate, because for all his uncertainty, for all his inexperience, he knew this was necessary. His death wasn't a noble Commander Thorn-like final stand. There was no moment of final defiance. One second he was running, and the very next he was crushed beneath the very thing they had come to steal. It was pointless and it was unfair. Yet in the end, it didn't matter, because Nemik was never the weapon, his words were. Nemik's manifesto remained and was passed into the hands of Cassian Andor, a man who, at the time, had no belief in the cause and no reason to fight beyond survival. But words, when written with conviction, have a way of just lingering. Cassian didn't internalize them at first. He'd spent too many years running and too many years learning that hope was dangerous. But Nemik's words didn't ask for belief. They asked for understanding. They weren't a plea, they were a statement of truth. Freedom is not given, it is taken. Oppression is unnatural, a distortion of balance that can never hold forever. The more control the Empire exerts, the more inevitable rebellion becomes. Cassian read those words, and one day he would believe them. Nemik didn't live to see the rebellion rise. He didn't see the day when the Empire's greatest weapon, the Death Star, was turned against itself. He didn't see the fleets gather and didn't hear the battle cries of the soldiers who would one day carry his ideals into war. But his words endured. Revolutions aren't built on battlefields alone. They're built in the minds of those who refuse to accept the world as it is. And Karis Nemik, in his short life, ensured that one day the galaxy would see the Empire for what it truly was. That is what made him so dangerous. That is what made his death meaningless to the Empire, but eternal to the rebellion. Despite key Sith tenets, the Empire didn't rule by passion nor anger or chaos, or the volatile emotions that drive men to violence. It rules through calculation, through quiet, methodical efficiency, and through the slow tightening of a grip that doesn't waver. And if the Empire could take human form, if it could manifest its ideals into a single individual, it would look something like Dedra Meero. Meero isn't driven by cruelty and doesn't revel in violence or indulge in sadism like the many other brutes who wear the Imperial crest. There's no reckless rage in her, and no emotional outbursts or personal vendetta against those she hunts. She simply hunts rebels because it's her job to do so. In a galaxy teeming with ambition, there's no room for anything less than absolute competence, because order isn't simply an ideal to believe in, it's a formula to be perfected. Dedra Meero isn't a villain in the way the rebellion would like to believe. She's not a monster. She's not the mindless cruelty of a stormtrooper's boot on a citizen's neck, nor the open malice of a moth gorging himself on stolen luxury. She's something far more terrifying. She's the inevitable result of a system that rewards those who think like machines. The Imperial Security Bureau is a place where weakness simply isn't tolerated and where status is fiercely fought for, where promotion isn't given but taken from those who don't deserve to hold it. The men who fill its halls don't see Dedra Meero as an equal. They don't see her as a threat at first. She's an outsider in a department built on hierarchy and tradition. A woman who's learned that in the Empire, competence is not enough. It's never enough. Men like Major Partagaz don't simply reward good work. They demand something more. A mind that sees beyond the obvious. A mind that understands how to manipulate the system as well as enforce it. And Dedra learns. She understands that patience is a weapon. She understands that to rise, she mustn't simply be better than the men around her. She's got to dismantle them. She's got to find cracks in their reports, expose their failures, prove not just her own worth, but the worthlessness of those who stand in her way. She doesn't care about being liked and doesn't need to be respected. She needs to be feared. And when the moment comes, when she presents her case before Partagaz, when she lays out the proof that her colleagues have missed, and when she makes him see what she sees, that rebellion isn't scattered but organized, not random but calculated, she doesn't beg for approval. She lets the data speak for itself, and in doing so, she wins. The Empire prides itself on control. It prides itself on the ability to detect threats before they can take shape, to eliminate insurgency before it spreads. It believes itself to be omniscient, to be unstoppable, but Dedra sees what others do not. The signs of rebellion aren't in the obvious places. They're not in grand speeches or public protests or open acts of defiance. They're in stolen Imperial equipment that appears in the wrong sectors. They're in seemingly unrelated thefts that form a pattern only when viewed from a greater distance. They're in the gaps, in the absences, in the silence between reports. She sees what her colleagues around her fail to see because she's not satisfied with maintaining order, she seeks to perfect it. She doesn't react to rebellion, she seeks to preempt it. And for that, the Empire rewards her. The tools of suppression are placed in her hands. She's given the power to do what must be done. She's sent to Ferrix, where the first cracks in Imperial authority have begun to show, and where the illusion of control has been momentarily broken. She doesn't arrive with reckless force, and she doesn't storm the streets with legions of stormtroopers. She simply arrives to listen, to observe, and to understand. And when the time comes, she will tighten the noose. Dedra Meero doesn't hesitate. She doesn't question herself. Others may look at what she does, the interrogations, the surveillance, the quiet methodical destruction of lives, and see cruelty. They may see evil, but Dedra doesn't see herself as cruel. She sees herself as correct, because rebellion to her isn't a crime, it's a flaw in the system, and flaws must be removed before they can spread. She watches Bix Caleen break beneath the weight of interrogation, and when she hears the silence that follows the screams, she doesn't flinch. She doesn't revel in it, doesn't gloat or linger in the moment like a man intoxicated by power. She simply moves on, because the work isn't yet finished. Because the data still needs to be collected, the analysis must be precise, the reports must be written, and the conclusions must be drawn. Because the machine must continue to function. And yet, there's something else beneath it all. Something deeper, something that even she doesn't fully recognize. She doesn't just seek to impose order, she wants to be the one holding the reins. She wants to shape the Empire. And that, in the end, may be the thing that damns her. The tragedy of Dedra Meero is that she believes herself untouchable. She believes that the logic, efficiency, and structure of the Empire are all that matters. She believes that if she simply does her job better than anyone else, she'll always win. But war isn't logical, rebellion isn't mathematical, it doesn't obey patterns. And when Ferrix erupts, when the funeral procession turns into a riot, when the people she thought were broken rise up and fight back, she's not standing above them as she always imagined she would. She's in the chaos, in the panic, caught in the streets as the Empire's illusion of control begins to fracture. She spent her life believing in order, but the battlefield is not ordered. And in that moment, Dedra Meero is afraid. Not of death, not of failure, but of the simple, undeniable realization that she doesn't understand chaos the way rebels do. And in the end, this is what might destroy her. Because tyranny doesn't last forever. And when the day comes when the Empire begins to fall, Dedra Meero won't be one of those watching from the safety of the Senate chambers or from a high-ranking office on Coruscant. She'll be there, on the ground, as the order she fought so hard to uphold begins to burn around her. Not all rebels carry blasters, and not all insurgents move in the shadows with false names and forged identifications. Some are simply people who make the wrong choice at the wrong time, who help the wrong person, who answer the wrong question, or who whisper in the wrong ear, and some of them suffer severely for it. Bix Caleen didn't ask for war, she didn't seek out revolution, but war has a way of choosing people long before they realize they're part of it. It drags them in, piece by piece, until there's no way out but through suffering. Bix wasn't a household rebellion name, she was someone who dared to care, and in an age where the Empire's greatest weapon was fear, that alone was enough to mark her for destruction. The Empire doesn't need grand acts of defiance to justify its cruelty. It doesn't need to catch you in an open act of treason. Sometimes, it's simply enough to know the wrong person. And on Ferrix, there was no one more dangerous to know than Cassian Andor. Life on Ferrix had never been easy, but it had been stable. Bix Caleen knew its rhythms, its rules, and the way people moved through its streets with quiet efficiency. The community was tight-knit, built on the unspoken understanding that survival meant looking out for one another. She was no stranger to hardship and had fought small battles before, the kind that left bruises but not scars. She had built something for herself, carved out an existence in the scrapyards and supply chains that kept Ferrix running. She had worked, traded, hustled, survived. She had loved too. Cassian had once been more than just a name that brought trouble to her door. He had been a part of her life, a presence she had let in, a piece of herself that she'd shared. But Cassian Andor wasn't the kind of man who stayed. He was always looking toward the next escape and the next opportunity, the next world beyond the one they knew. Still, even when he left, she'd never truly shut him out, even when it would have been safer and even when it would have been smarter. Because some people, no matter how much trouble they bring, will always have a place in your life. And that, more than anything else, is what doomed her. When Bix agreed to contact Luth and Rail, when she used her access to the secretive communication network that operated in the quiet corners of the galaxy, she wasn't thinking of revolution, nor was she thinking of war. She was simply helping Cassian. That was all. But the Empire doesn't care about intent. It doesn't differentiate between those who seek to overthrow it and those who simply find themselves in the orbit of rebellion. And once the Primor authorities' failure on Ferrix brought the ISB's attention, once Dedra Miro began to dig into the cracks of the story, and once the Empire turned its gaze upon her world, there was no escape. Bix had sent a message, she'd opened a channel, and she'd connected two men who the Empire wished had never met. And that was all the Empire needed to justify breaking her. In the interrogation room, there's only the slow erosion of self, the breaking down of mind and body until nothing remains but compliance. Bix Caleen was strong, stronger than most, but the Empire didn't need her to fight. It only needed her to lose. In classic Imperial fashion, the method was calculated cruelty, not brute force. Violence can create martyrs, pain can create rage, but fear burrows deep. The ISB didn't need to lay a hand on her to tear her apart. They only needed her to listen. The screams were not her own. That was what made it worse. The weaponized recording seeped into her brain like poison and ensured that even after the questioning ended, it would never truly leave her. They didn't just hurt her, they rewired her. And when they finally let her go, when they dragged her back to her cell, she wasn't whole anymore. There are wounds that fade with time, bruises that heal, and bones that mend. But there are wounds that never close, wounds that exist not on the body but in the mind, in places that no one can see. Bix Caleen survived. She lived where others might have died, endured where others might have given in, but survival isn't the same as escape. She didn't leave Ferrix as the woman she'd been before. She left with a hollowed out mind, with eyes that saw but didn't focus, with a body that still moved but no longer knew why. She'd always been sharp, always quick-witted, always one step ahead of those who underestimated her, but the Empire had taken something from her, something that no stolen starship or new beginning could ever give back. There are things that just cannot be undone. And even as she sat among those who risked their lives to get her out, even as the ship carried her away from the burning streets of Ferrix, even as she breathed free air again, she wasn't free, because she would never truly be free again. The rebellion would grow, the Empire would fall, the day would come when the galaxy would know Cassian Andor's name, when they would speak of his sacrifice, when they would tell the story of what he gave to ensure that others could fight in his place. Bix Caleen would live to see that day. She would hear of his death, and she wouldn't be surprised. Because she'd always known, even in the earliest days when they were young, even when he had simply been Cassian, that he was the kind of man who burned too brightly to last. But knowing him had cost her. The ISB would forget her name. She would never appear in the official records of the rebellion. There would be no statues, no medals, no speeches. She wouldn't be remembered as a soldier, nor as a leader, nor as a hero. But she had paid the price all the same. Because war doesn't only take the lives of those who fight it. Sometimes, it takes the ones who are simply close enough to be caught in its wake. Droids in the Star Wars universe are usually portrayed as little more than tools, machines built to serve, to calculate, and to perform their tasks without question and without hesitation. They carried no real weight in history. They didn't hold memories that mattered, nor did they linger in the thoughts of those who left them behind. But memory is a complicated thing. Droids were built to process and to retain information and store data in neat, efficient archives that could be accessed when needed. But what happens when that memory becomes something more? When the lines between function and feeling blur? When a droid remembers not just information, but people? When it learns not just commands, but grief? B2EMO, or just B, was never meant to stand out. He wasn't a tactical droid, not a starship co-pilot, or one of the other countless Imperial machines designed for surveillance and suppression. He was small and unassuming, a rust-colored salvage droid built to serve a single family on a world that the galaxy didn't care about. He should have been forgettable. But B didn't forget, and that's what made him special. Ferrix was a world of laborers, salvage yards, and machinery, of people who understood that survival was built on community, loyalty, and on knowing when the time came you would have someone standing beside you. B wasn't just another piece of equipment in that system, he was part of it. For the Andor family, he was more than just a droid. He was a presence and a fixture of their home, something constant in a world that was always shifting. He was there when Cassian was young, his cylindrical frame rolling through the streets of Ferrix and his voice carrying over the hum of machinery. He was there through the good days and bad, through the small joys and quiet griefs, always waiting, always ready. He was there to assist, to carry, to follow instructions, but his true function was something that had never been programmed into him. He remembered. When Marva Andor died, Ferrix mourned. The streets that had once been filled with her defiance fell silent. The people who had once looked to her as a quiet leader felt the weight of her absence. And in the home that had once been her, B refused to move. Droids weren't meant to grieve. They weren't meant to feel the absence of those they served, and weren't meant to linger in the empty spaces they left behind. They were built for practicality, for function, and for efficiency. But B was different. He didn't shut down. He didn't process the loss as just another event to be archived. He curled into himself, hesitant, fragile, and unable to process a world without the woman who had been his entire purpose. I don't want to be alone. The words were small and spoken with the trembling uncertainty of something that should not understand what it means to lose someone. But B understood, because a droid that can remember is a droid that can grieve. Ferrix rose because of Marva's words, courage, and her refusal to bend to Imperial rule even in death. But as the people of Ferrix fought back and as riot batons swung and explosions erupted in the streets, B's place in the rebellion was something quieter and deeper. He was the echo of a life that the Empire had tried to erase. He carried the message. He was the last voice of Marva Andor, the vessel through which her final defiance reached the ears of her people. His small, rusted frame stood in the heart of the crowd, and when the recording played, when her voice filled the square telling them to wake up, to fight, to stand. He was no longer just a droid. He was proof that memory cannot be erased. The Empire could seize control, it could arrest, it could execute, could burn entire cities to the ground, but it couldn't undo what had already been lived, what had already been felt, what had already been remembered. B, in his own way, was a rebellion of his own. Cassian Andor didn't come back to Ferrix the same man who had fled it. He'd been changed, broken and reforged into something harder and sharper. He was no longer running from the Empire, he was preparing to fight it. But some things hadn't changed. B was still there, waiting like he always had, remembering like he always would. Cassian couldn't bring his mother back. He couldn't undo what had happened. He couldn't erase the suffering and couldn't make the grief disappear. But he could do one thing. He could take the last piece of home that remained. And when the time came to leave Ferrix behind, when the last moments of that life faded into the past, B left with him. Because droids don't dream. They don't long for adventure and don't seek meaning in the way that humans do. But B had never just been a droid. He was a keeper of memory. And as long as he remembered, home was never truly gone. Revolutions begin in the shadows and in whispered conversations, in acts so small and so fragile that they seem to be destined to be forgotten. The Aldhani Heist should have been one of those moments. It should have been a robbery, nothing more. A simple theft carried out by desperate men and women buried under the weight of 1,000 other bureaucratic failures. It should have just been another problem for the Empire to solve, another inconvenience to be written off in the vast machinery of Imperial control. But it wasn't, because the Empire didn't see it coming, because it wasn't prepared to be made vulnerable, because in stealing its payroll and exposing its weaknesses and forcing it to react, the rebels didn't just take something, they forced the Empire to show its teeth, and in doing so, they shattered the illusion that the Empire was untouchable. No one on Aldhani was supposed to survive. That was the unspoken truth, the reality that settled over the mission long before the first shot was fired. It was a plan built on necessity and on sacrifice, on the understanding that some causes demanded everything long before they offered anything in return. Vel Sartha knew it. She'd carried it from the beginning, the quiet certainty that leadership was a burden, not a privilege. She'd been given this task not because she wanted it, but because someone had to see it through. Cinta Kaz knew it. There'd never been a version of this mission where she walked away. She'd already made peace with the idea that she'd die for the cause, because she had no intention of doing anything else. Nemik believed in something bigger than all of them. He'd spent his life writing about rebellion, theorizing about it, understanding its inevitability. But theory and reality are never the same, and when the plan became action, when the stolen uniforms were donned and the garrison loomed ahead, he found himself standing at the crossroads between his ideals and his fear. Cassian Andor didn't believe in the cause. He was there for the money, for survival, for one last job before he could disappear into the void of the galaxy. The war was not his war. The rebellion was not his rebellion. But the war doesn't ask for volunteers. It doesn't wait for people to believe before it takes them. And as the night unfolded, as the heist moved from careful precision to brutal chaos, Cassian began to understand something that would stay with him long after the credits were spent. There was no walking away, not from this. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. A garrison, isolated and overconfident. A celestial event, the Eye of Aldhani, that would provide cover. A small team, outnumbered but unseen, underestimated, dismissed by an empire that had grown complacent. Plans are just words until the moment they must be acted upon. The theft wasn't clean, it wasn't precise, it wasn't the kind of story that history remembers as a flawless strike against oppression. It was messy, brutal, and desperate. The hostages were frightened, the soldiers resistant, the weight of the stolen credits slowing them down even as time slipped through their fingers. People died. Taramman was the first, a man who had once worn the Empire's armor and had chosen, in the end, to fight against it. Gorn followed soon after, executed by the same men who had once stood at his command, his defection erased in an instant by the cold finality of a blaster bolt. Nemik, the idealist, the dreamer, was crushed beneath the weight of the very thing they had stolen, his body pinned and his mind still working even as his breath failed him. And Arvel Skeen, the liar, the opportunist, the man who had always been waiting for a moment to turn the cause into his own advantage, met his end not at the hands of the Empire, but by Cassian's own blaster. There was no time to process, there was only the getaway, the frantic escape through the Eye of Aldhani, through a sky set ablaze with the fire of a world that had not yet realized it was part of a revolution. Cassian didn't believe in the rebellion, but he didn't hesitate when Nemik, broken and dying, whispered the last words that would ever matter. Climb. It would have been easy for the Empire to dismiss the heist. A payroll robbery, a handful of stolen credits, a small embarrassment, nothing more. But the Empire was not built to acknowledge weakness, it wasn't built to tolerate failure, and so it reacted the only way it knew how, with terror. New laws, harsher sentences, sweeping arrests. Entire systems forced to feel the consequences of what had happened on an insignificant world in the Outer Rim. The ISP was given full authority and was free to hunt, to silence, and to make an example of anyone who even whispered the word rebellion. The Empire didn't just tighten its grip, it overcompensated, and in doing so, it created the very thing it feared most. Because oppression, once made unbearable, does not create obedience, it creates resistance. For the galaxy, the Aldhani Heist was the first undeniable crack in the facade of Imperial control. The first moment when people looked at the Empire and saw not unstoppable power, but vulnerability. For Cassian Andor, It was the moment he stopped being a man who could pretend to exist outside the war. And for the rebellion, it was the moment the Empire proved exactly how terrified it was of losing control. The payroll was never the point. The credits, the stolen wealth, the financial losses, none of it mattered in the end. What mattered was the reaction, the moment the Empire felt threatened enough to show its true face. Because the Empire didn't fear attacks on its garrisons. It feared the idea that people might realize it could be attacked at all. There had been a time when Cassian Andor believed he could run forever, that the war could be kept at a distance, and that survival was something he could achieve alone. He'd spent his life slipping through the cracks of the galaxy, avoiding the fight, believing that resistance was a death sentence. But war followed him anyway. It had found him on Ferrix, in the eyes of the people he had grown up with, in the echoes of Martha's final words. It had found him in the streets as the riot began, as the people who had once only whispered of defiance began to shout. It had found him in the choices he could no longer avoid, in the realization that this was never just about him. And so, when the dust settled, when the fighting was over and the Empire lay wounded but not yet defeated, Cassian didn't run. He walked into the fire willingly. He didn't beg for mercy, he didn't plead for a place to hide, he offered himself to the rebellion. Not as a hired gun, not as a reluctant participant, but as a man who had finally chosen a side. Luthen Rael had spent months trying to turn him into a soldier, into something more than a man just looking for his next payday. He had given him the choice before, he'd tried to force him into the fight, but Cassian had never been ready. Now, he was. And in that moment, Luthen understood that the rebellion had just gained something far more valuable than a soldier. It had gained a man with nothing left to lose. Season 2 won't be a story of recruitment. Cassian Andor has been forged in the fire of Ferrix, shaped by loss, by survival, and the realization that there's no world in where he can stand aside and watch. He's no longer running. And that means the war is coming to him in full. The rebellion isn't yet the structured force that will one day take down the Death Star. It's still fractured and still operating in the dark, held together by people like Luthen who understand that survival is a game of patience. But patience has its limits, and the events of Ferrix have ensured that the Empire is no longer content with waiting. The ISB has seen the cracks forming. Dedra Meero has just begun to understand that the rebellion is not just scattered insurgents, but a coordinated force growing in the shadows. She's hunted Cassian once before, she's not going to stop now. Mon Mothma's made her first irreversible decision, sacrificing her personal life to keep the rebellion funded. There's no turning back for her, no way to remain inside the Empire's halls without risking everything. The Senate is a dead system and she knows it. The time for politics is ending. And somewhere in the galaxy, the foundations of the Rebel Alliance are beginning to form. Cassian's journey won't be one of discovery anymore. He's already made his choice. Now, it'll be a story of becoming the man who will one day walk onto Scarif knowing that he will never leave. Season 2 will be the slow march toward that final moment and the unraveling of the last pieces of the life he once lived, the transformation of a man who was never supposed to be a hero into someone willing to give his life for a cause that once meant nothing to him. The final episode of Andor Season 1 didn't end with victory, it ended with a promise that this war is far from over and that the Empire has no idea what's coming for it.